Imagine you're a TV producer. You're given the challenge of trying to adapt one of the battle scenes from War and Peace. You have a certain amount of money set aside to do so, enough for several dozen extras and a few effects shots. What priorities are going to govern the choices you make, and how will you work within the limitations prescribed for you? These are the essential questions that will have a direct impact upon the finished product. The scene from the book can be summarized as follows. A column of Russian troops is advancing downhill when it is surprised by a French column, who come upon them much closer than expected. A Russian cries out, "That's it, lads," and the soldiers run away in panic. Andrei dismounts his horse and picks up the flag. "Forward, boys," he shouts. The men rally around them and he charges them towards a gun emplacement that is being overrun by French troops. As he runs, he is wounded and he falls, still holding the flag. The action is described clearly enough and makes stirring reading, but it presents a few problems from your TV producer's perspective. First, the scale is too big. Each one of these columns might consist of hundreds of people. We can't afford to put both on the screen at the same time. This thing with the cannon emplacement is confusing and seems unrelated to the main action of fleeing and rallying. It should probably just be cut. It also gives the impression of just being a tiny corner of the battle with no sense of the larger tactical moves, successes or failures. Wouldn't it be nicer to give a greater sense of the overall battle, make it feel like we're actually bearing witness to everything that's going on? I mean, we can't do the real scale justice. This battle involved 150,000 men, but we can hint at it in a couple of effect shots. And then we can just get our extras to change uniforms, play French and Russians in different shots. We'll just cut it together all chaotic like. You'd never know. It'll be just like Band of Brothers. And speaking of cannons, why don't we hammer home just how much our guys are losing? They could be getting shot at, blown apart by cannon fire. It might make Andrei's moment of courage that much more meaningful. I can see it. It could be in slow motion. He'd be like, "Rah!" I tell you, it'd be beautiful. Okay. So you've probably guessed by now that I'm not the biggest fan of how this scene was staged. And if you're willing to listen, I'd like to go through why, preferably in excruciating detail. So, let's start by talking about special effects. In an ideal world, we could imagine wanting to shoot all of this with real elements, but unless you have the support of the Soviet government and the Red Army, that's probably not going to be possible. So, you could either scale back the real elements only to what you can achieve, or have some amount of fake elements. These days, usually that means CGI. It's not always the best option, but it's the default one. Now, talented filmmakers will have a way of mixing fake and real elements so that you're never sure when you're looking at which. This famous shot from Jurassic Park is a good example, where a real animatronic head leaves frame and a CGI dinosaur walks back in. But if you're a more timid sort, you're more likely to keep the real and fake elements in separate rooms so that they're never allowed to contaminate each other. Then you'll just rely on the alleged magic of editing to smooth over the gaps. The more chaotic the editing, the better from this standpoint. Now, I think the pursuit of chaos is a dubious cinematic goal at best. Everyone remembers that great opening scene from Saving Private Ryan, and Band of Brothers also employed a similar style, though modified to conceal its more limited budget. You can see the comparison here, where in Saving Private Ryan all the elements are allowed to commingle on screen at the same time, whereas in Band of Brothers everything is kept in separate shots. The tanks and the German soldiers and the American soldiers aren't allowed to exist in the same space. And this is where a problem creeps in, because a style that was very suited to the war it depicted suddenly gets applied to everything regardless of how appropriate it is. The Napoleonic Wars were fought in a very different way to World War II, less ducking and running as machine gun fire rattles overhead and more marching slowly towards the enemy as they fire volleys at you. So why is the same style used here? Fashion. If the cuts go faster than the mind can register, the viewer can be fooled into thinking that they see more than is actually there. But of course, fooling the viewer is what good screencraft is all about, so this is where the second problem comes in. Very few filmmakers know how to put more than one subject on screen at the same time. Reverse shot, as powerful a tool as it can be, becomes a habit. Shots of Russians, shots of French, shots of cannons firing, shots of explosions, people flying through the air. If you're looking for any sense of spatial relationship linking these shots, you're not going to find it. It seems to me that if you're marching forwards and there are cannons on a hill to your right firing at you, it's important to know where they are in relation to you, at what distance and at what elevation. But these considerations did not influence the shots that were taken. "But my poor budget," the producer cries. And this is where I assert that the main deficit is not one of budget but of imagination. No technique is allowed to mix with any others. As I said, effects shots stay cordoned off in their own area. The process could not conceive of mixing shots of real soldiers with VFX soldiers filling out the background. The process could not conceive of putting, say, 10 extras in the foreground and the rest 50 feet away opposite them. It could not conceive of putting these men and these cannons in the same shot. No, every element must be kept safely apart. Now, putting these together wouldn't cost any more money than was already spent. All the elements are already there. We are simply seeing the refusal to meet the logistical challenges therein. Now, just for fun, let's take a look at how the Russian movie from the 1960s tackled adapting the same sequence. Is it a fair comparison? No, but I'm not in a fair mood, so let's go.
В 5 часу вечера сражение было проиграно на всех пунктах.
Это неприятель! Нет! Смотрите же! Братцы! Ты раненый? Рана не здесь, а вот где! Остановитесь! Ох, Волконский, что же это? Ребята, вперед!
Now, of course it's not reasonable to expect the BBC to be able to equal this with their resources, but I think you could get close these days. Just looking through this casually, you could see how there'd be opportunities to fake this. You know, you could have real guys here in the foreground and CGI guys there in the background, and maybe stick 20 or so real guys down here as a reference for the computer people when they get their hands on it. And you might not want to hold the shot as long as they do, but I think that's mitigated by the fact that for most of the shot you're staring at quite a small number of people. Now, I'm not saying that the BBC should have just copied what the Russian movie did, but I would have liked to see them exercise at least a little bit of imagination, instead of just filming it ABC how to shoot a battle scene on £2.50. We can do better than this.
Mediocre!